apologise, this is my only busy slide. But in terms of policy response, I've spent some time with international policymakers on this issue, and it is very complex, and I just want to kind of stratify that for you. These days we operate in a whole system. It wasn't so long ago when we studied economics and we studied Friedman and Keynes and those kind of models, which is pump the economic money supply or pump the economy through fiscal stimulus, that we used to have effectively what were a series of dams and levies, being currencies and a range of things. These days we have floating currencies. We have hedge traders who trade and accelerate huge volumes of derivatives. There's huge amounts of sums flying around the world. That looks more complex. If you can map it, it'd probably look something like ocean currents, but probably going much faster. Much, much, much more faster. There's a very complex world in which we operate. We need to think about that differently. Of course, within that, there's not only movements of capital around the world, but there's also movements of talent, and we've talked about some of that. Within that, you have regulators. Think about them as the umpires within the game, if you like, who help keep us on track. There's a new concept, and you'll notice the whole system is a language that's developed. This is global policy I'm talking about here. The language now they're talking about is systemic participants. You may have heard this notion of too big to fail, also known as moral hazard. And really what that's about is that an organisation may be so large that if they fail or have significant disruption, it sends the entire system into shock. And that's what we saw in the GFC. And then, of course, we have other participants, which tend to be listed entities and other participants, different structures within that, which, unless you're a bank, is normally the area in which we play. And then we have a whole bunch of scales happening, which is at a global scale, a range of things are happening. I was very encouraged, actually, when I heard Lindsay Tanner speak at the same session that Al Gore was at. He made a plea to the international community to say, look, we are a global system, and if we don't set global parameters and rules, and we deal with this individually, all we'll do is transfer the problem and make it worse. There was a real acknowledgement of that. I think he's been heard, and I'm very encouraged by that. There's a concept which they call regulatory arbitrage, which is, I guess, a nice bit of jargon to say pushing the problem to someone else and waiting for it to come back to you. But if you look at what happened with regulation in the United States, they introduced a thing called Sarbanes-Oxley, which was a very prescriptive piece of legislation around a range of things. Perversely, the impact of actually making their system feel safer or have a reaction was that people stopped raising capital in New York and they all went to London. So that's the regulatory arbitrage. People will go where the rules are easiest to do business. Very, very difficult, very complex policy responses. What you will see a call for is for policy responses which make us feel good. So let's cap the remuneration, let's do a range of things that make us feel good about that, but without the whole system in context, actually we'll end up with perverse consequences and we may end up there again. I think it's important to understand risk as a continuum. Think about this as a Maslow's hierarchy of needs or similar, if you're familiar with that concept and that resonates with you. But in essence, we have a compliance capability, which is, do we comply with the laws and regulations and policies and rules? We can do that pretty well. We have some stuff around reporting, which is, are we accurate in what we say in relation to financials in particular? We have operations, which is the day-to-day, and the strategic, which tends to be the future of our business models and where we are tomorrow. There's a misinterpretation and a misconception that happens within the risk profession that people think we're only talking about those bottom two boxes, and that's tragic. The ASX Corporate Governance Council, of which I'm a member, set out some rules in 2003. We call them principles, but they are rules. And in essence, they said, look, you need to have a sound system of risk management, and the inference was you need to be holistic in that. That was misunderstood and reduced, and people only focused on reporting and compliance. We see some of the effects of that today. So they've restated and amplified, and effectively what they've said, look, risk management is about focusing on what matters. You need all that hygiene capability, not to take away from that. That's also important, but that's not what the regulators were asking for. And this is becoming the prevailing thought around the world, which means this is becoming common law, and some of those responsibilities are going to shoot home to us, irrespective of entity type. The petri dish on that is the listed environment in Australia. So the rules are, effectively, to say, look, we're going to put some accountability around this. We're going to get the board, or the governing body, if you like, to require management, who are the ones running the business, normally the chief executive and team, to design and implement risk management systems that manage the company's material business risks. And what they mean by that are the ones that really have an impact on the valuation of the organisation and the future value of the organisation. They link it to the concept of continuous disclosure. If an informed shareholder needs to know about it, they're probably the ones we want you thinking about. Don't get lost in the minutiae. Don't fall for that trap. The other piece that they ask is for management to report to them as to whether those risks are being managed effectively. Now, this does two important things. You saw Lehman, the chap that was there, was also the chairman and CEO. In Australia, we tend to have a good separation between boards and management. They are separate for very good reasons. My understanding is, I think of all 10 American banks that ended up in trouble, each one, the chairman and CEO, was the same officer. And so there wasn't that independent vehicle and mechanism for true reflection. That changed shortly after subprime. So the real key thing is, are we managing those effectively? Now, to be very clear about that, managing risk effectively doesn't mean eliminating, avoiding, reducing necessarily. It means an understanding of where we're at. Do we actually know what our risks are? And do we know where we sit with those? And we're comfortable with that. And I'll come back about the dimension of risk-taking versus risk-avoiding. This is a great report if you're interested in this. It's the World Economic Forum report, which is the peak network that collects this kind of information. It's open source and free, so if you're interested, you can get the reference or Google that, or happy to give you that link. Risk is plotted in two dimensions, and many people will be familiar with this. On the bottom axis, we have likelihood or probability, if you like, and on the vertical axis, we have impact, and in this case measured in economic terms, up to trillions of dollars. This on a global space was where they saw the risks in 2009, and there's a range of those. The top right-hand quadrant are the things that are very likely and likely to have significant impact. They're the ones in sharp focus. There's lots of them. This is the scale that goes, the key that goes with those, and you can see everything there from food price volatility to oil and gas issues, major fall in the US dollar, a whole range of things. Things for us all to consider. The one I'd like to highlight is the slowing in the Chinese economy. People saw that as an enormous economic condition to be managed, and people were really concerned that if it slowed to 6%, then the world economy stalls. I'd just like to think through for a minute what that means. 6% is fairly rapid growth, as we all know. And there's really part of the solution is potentially to return it to 8. One of the things we need to understand in a resource-constrained world, and we've talked about this recently, is 8% growth year-on-year compound is a doubling every 8 years. So if an economy like China, and this one has been singled out in this report, but it's the same around the world, if we do continue to grow at that compound rate, what does that look like if we're a consumptive society? Interesting enough, those risks are not in this table. And I think that screams at me.